Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historian podcast. I am very pleased to be your host today, Brian Watson. Today is a very different episode. As some of you might know, I am currently attending Indiana University Bloomington to get a master's in library science. I'm focusing in digital humanities and archives and research management, as that's kind of where my interests lie. But one of my jobs at IU is working at the Scholarly Communications Department as a graduate assistant. Scholarly Communications, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is defined by the ACRL as describing how research is created, evaluated, distributed, and preserved. What that means in practice, especially at big universities with university presses, is that it's a very new department. It tends to focus on providing support for faculty and university libraries by publishing research that's done at the university. The term research is broad, though. It can mean anything from traditional journal articles to genome data to presentations, posters, and so on and so forth. For example, at IU, if you go to scholarworks, that's one word, .iu, as in Indiana University, .edu, you can see a lot of different things that have been published there, from programs to posters and everything I just mentioned. A lot of scholarly communications librarians are huge supporters of open access. This is what today's podcast is about. As many of you might know, open access is the idea and the movement that research, especially academic research, should be, in the words of Peter Stuber, digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions, end quote. It is absolutely compatible with peer review. Open access, it holds many benefits towards both authors and their fields. For example, it lowers the boundaries of access to individuals in lower income countries, which kind of allows increased education, cooperation, and benefit. It means that the paper can be read by more than a limited number of people with journal subscriptions, or by people who do not have access to academic material through college libraries. Indeed, as publisher subscription costs go up, and if you're familiar with Paywall the movie, they're going up and up and up, and it's becoming more unaffordable for even some college libraries that could afford the resources for their students. This will be part of my interview with Brandt Ellsworth, which is the first part of the episode today, where he talks about that his students couldn't access his own research without paying hundreds of dollars. OA, or open access, is enabled largely by the internet and by the consent of the author or the copyright holder. OA really got started in the 90s with the founding of ARXIV.org, which is a quote-unquote preprint repository of papers for physicists. That means there is a place for physicists to put their work before it's actually been published in a journal. So OA has been tremendously successful in the sciences as a result. It's also becoming popular among other fields. In fact, it increases the number of citations an author sees. It allows for further use of research data or primary source materials, and it in fact leads to increased funding. All of the major European research organizations are now requiring that all research be published as open access, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually just jumped on board the open access train as well. The reason I'm bringing this podcast to you today, and the reason I'm presenting this idea to Ask Historians as a whole, is to take the first steps towards open access and Ask Historians by making flared user answers open access to a Creative Commons license. This will be totally voluntary and on a case-by-case basis, not mandated at all, but it will hopefully help contribute towards the expansion of knowledge and research internationally. It will allow for increased author attention to answers, and it will enable work done here to be based on the thing we have answered. I have done this on my own Flare page, which you can see at reddit.com/r/historians/wiki/profiles/annals pornography. That is ANNALSPORNOGRAPHIE. Or by making a comment at the bottom of your answer. If you've answered the question, Ask Historians that follows our rules. You can do CC-BY-SA or whatever sort of Creative Commons license that you've answered. A CC license, Creative Commons that is, also enables other use, commercial, non-commercial, or alike, or remixed. You get to kind of set the boundaries of the license you choose. For example, you can see my profile, in which I have noted that my answers are CC by SA, which means, to quote from Creative Commons, in fancy legalese, this license let others remix, tweak, and build upon your work even for commercial reasons, as long as they credit you and the license in a new creation under the identical terms. This license is often compared to copyleft, free, and open source software licenses. All new work based on yours will carry the same license, or any of that derivatives will allow commercial use. This license is used by Wikipedia, and it's recommended for materials that would benefit from incorporating content from Wikipedia and similar licensed projects. And what follows, I will have 2 open access interviews that I did at IU Scholarly Communications. The first is with Dr. Brandt Ellsworth, who's the Assistant Professor of Humanities in the School of Humanities and Sciences. He received his doctorate from Penn State Harrisburg in American Studies, with a dissertation that examined the role of Western mythology in the Americanization process of Mormons during the late 19th and early 20th century. Brandt currently serves as the editor of the Children's Folklore Review, which regularly publishes articles on all aspects of children's tradition. He also serves as the vice president of the Eastern American Studies Association. We kind of talk about how he came to do the research he does, how he came to run this journal, and what got him interested in open access in general, and what OA means for folklorists and more. And I think it's a really fascinating answer for a lot of historians as well. The second interview is with Willa C. Liber-Tavernier, and I will introduce her before that.
Then I'll just start by saying, by kind of asking you what context you work in, what's your name, your title, and kind of give us some context for what you do as research.
Great. Yeah, so my name is Brandt Ellsworth. I am the Assistant Professor of Humanities at Central Penn College, which is a small school located just outside of Harrisburg across the Susquehanna River in the capital of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. I am affiliated with the American Folklore Society, both as a member and as an editor for this journal. The Children's Folklore Review comes from the Children's Folklore section, which is one of many sections offered by the American Folklore Society. The research I do a lot of research. The research for me personally versus the research I do for this publication and its content. There's a little overlap, but me as a researcher, scholar, and me as an editor are kind of 2 different hats. So personally, I do the majority of my research under the field of Mormon studies or Mormon history studies or performance studies, whereas my journal focuses primarily on children's folklore, children's traditions, children's material culture.
How did you get interested, or how did you get recruited, I guess, for doing the children's folklore research?
Yeah, the recruited piece is the big one. So when I was in graduate school, I began attending American Folklore Society conferences, and I was working on a paper for in a folklore class with Dr. Simon Bronner, who is an Indiana University alum. And I was writing about a topic called piano performance. I grew up playing the piano. I knew that there was this creative way that children would engage with piano play. So piano play, what I define as something outside of just playing the piano, it's a way for people to play games essentially on the piano. Anyways, I had been writing about it, and Dr. Bronner recommended I attend the American Folklore Society section with children's folklore. I did, and they wrote me into participating. I think after that first meeting, I was involved as a secretary, and then I got more involved doing book review editing. And then in 2016, the editor of the journal, Trevor Blank, who's at Potsdam, he had to step away from his post, and he reached out to me and said, "Hey, Brandt, would you be interested?" I was like, "Well, sure, I guess." So I took over in December of 2016 and rushed together our first issue, which was in honor of Dr. Simon Bronner.
And what about your own personal research?
That's a longer, different story. When I was in my the full story, when I was a freshman, I finished my first semester at Brigham Young University, and absolutely had no idea what I was doing. In fact, a side note, when I entered the university for the very first time and did my first tour, this was the week that school started, they asked me what I wanted to major in, and I said, architecture. And they said, "You came to the wrong school. We have no architecture program." I was like, "What? What am I doing?" So after that first semester, I stepped away from school. I dropped out. I moved to Seoul, South Korea, and I lived there for 2.5 years. And in that time, I learned Korean, I learned Korean culture, I lived with a Korean family, I dated a Korean girl. And in so many ways, I lost myself. At the same time, I learned a lot about myself. And one of the things that I learned was that I loved to teach. I wasn't good at teaching, but I loved who I became when I was in front of a group of people. And so I returned after that hiatus, knowing that eventually I wanted to teach. I didn't know where, though. In that first semester back at BYU, I took a general education class called American Heritage, which is interdisciplinary. Students are asked to explore the American foundation through the lenses of economics, political science, popular culture. And I absolutely loved this class. I remember after the first test, someone asked me, what would you do to be happy in life? And I said, if I could be that guy, meaning the professor of this class, I would forever be happy. So I went to him, I asked him, how did you get to do what you are doing? Because I want to be you. And he said, I have my degrees in American Studies. And so that's what I declared. I became an American Studies major. I graduated. I applied for graduate school and moved to Penn State University, where I worked with Simon Bronner, a completed master's and PhD program. The topic, however, that was a little bit more difficult because I didn't want to be, full disclosure, I went to BYU, I do Mormon studies, right? My background is in Mormonism. However, I didn't want to be the Mormon who also studies Mormonism. That was too narrow for me. But I realized that I had a perspective and experience and perhaps even my desire to not be associated by my religion and my scholarship allowed me a unique approach to that field. And so after a lot of heeing and hawing, I eventually settled in kind of on a topic in American Mormon studies. Mm-hmm. And I've run with it ever since.
That's great. That's a great story. And it definitely plays to have the interdisciplinary nature of the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree.
I did kind of want to start, ask more in detail about your journal in open access. Can you talk to me about the journal a little bit? Like when was it established? What kind of research has it published specifically?
So the Children's Folklore Review is an offshoot of the Children's Folklore section of the American Folklore Society. So that's a lot of steps. The Children's Folklore section was established in the late 1970s. American Folklore Society was established back in the 19th century, but it took, almost 100 years for a section devoted to children's studies to be established. At that same time, this was in Detroit, at annual conferences in Detroit and Salt Lake City. Those early founders believed that it was necessary not just to research, but to have a platform for the publication of that research. And so I think it was 1978 or 79, the Children's Folklore newsletter was established and would publish every year or twice a year research scholarship findings related to children's folklore. In the early years, it was published by Chip Sullivan, who was based out of Eastern Carolina University. In the early 90s, that newsletter evolved into something even bigger. And again, under the tutelage of Dr. Sullivan, it expanded into a full-fledged journal. The journal has since had a variety of leaders. Jay Meckling, Priscilla Ord, Simon Bronner, Libby Tucker, and then more recently, Trevor Blank have all overseen the journal. In the past, the journal has primarily focused on publishing reviews and articles related to children's folklore. So this includes things like traditions and jokes, material culture, clothing, examples of folklore and literature. Our last issue was published in June. It was our first open access issue. And in that, you could find articles written about slumber parties and the way that slumber parties function, the games that children or teenagers will play at slumber parties. And that article primarily focuses on slumber parties as a rite of passage for these teenagers, which certainly rings true to me. I remember my first slumber parties as kind of this opportunity to break from conventional norms of behavior that teenagers are often engaged in. It's also a place where a lot of subversive behavior can take place. The first time we start thinking about, Bloody Mary in front of the mirror took place, at least for me. Ouija boards took place here at slumber parties. Anyways, so that's kind of an example of the type of articles that we primarily focus on.
That's interesting. I did actually read that article. It caught
Did
my
you?
eye when I was like, this is so fascinating. I just can't stop reading it. It's so really, really interesting.
Yeah, and Alina Mansfield was a graduate student. She was the winner of the W.W. Newell Prize last year for outstanding graduate research in children's folklore. And I guess that's a plug I should make. The journal also, in the section, does offer awards to faculty, graduate students, and I believe undergraduates. Anyone interested in doing archival research or other types of research in children's folklore.
Yeah, and you mentioned the open aspect part of the journal. Can you talk kind of about what open access means to you specifically?
Yeah, well, so my experience with open access has evolved a lot over time. I mentioned I am a product of Brigham Young University and Penn State University, right? Giant institutions. After I graduated, my first post was at a smaller college in York, Pennsylvania, York College. And I worked there for 3 years as an adjunct. And then I took a post at my current place at Central Penn College. Kind of the background of Central Penn is important to understanding my evolution of thought on open access. Right? Because I assumed that education and classroom experiences were consistent regardless of where you went, whether it was a big research public institution, a small private school. So Central Penn College has maybe 1,500 students. The majority of our students are first generation. As a smaller school, we draw heavily from Philadelphia, from Harrisburg, from New York City. And for many of these students, as I said, it's their first experience within their family and in an institution of higher learning. We don't have a giant endowment. We don't have massive numbers of faculty or staff. We are growing, but we are limited by a lot of factors. And as an institution that's enrollment admissions driven, we do not have access to a lot of the big journals. So I first saw this when I was trying to do my own research, and I went to my library's website and thought, wait, where is everything? And that made it even difficult for my students. When I want to have my students do some deep archival research, when I want them to use databases, they do not have access to that same literature that I had access to when I was an undergraduate or graduate student. And then as an editor for this journal, I recognized that if I wanted my students to read my own work legally and responsibly, we would have to go through a paywall. And frankly, that's something that my students, given their backgrounds, aren't prepared to make. It's something I'm not prepared to do on behalf of my students. And it's something my institution cannot afford. So open access really began to nag at me when I became concerned about access. When that became a driving point in my teaching, my pedagogical approaches, I felt it was important for the democratization of information and knowledge that all people, including students at higher education that do not have the same opportunities as other larger institutions, should have access to that information. And so open access means everything to me personally. Now, as an editor for the journal, frankly, our journal is not very large. We've been issuing print versions for almost 20 years. But after I did my first issue and I got my distribution list, I recognized that all of that work and all of that, the money spent on editing and production, it was only going to just over 100 subscribers. And I had a hard time justifying the cost with the product,
Yeah.
especially as a small organization where we don't have a lot of money coming in. I recognize this as a financial issue as well, that our organization, the Children's Folklore section, wouldn't be solvent in 5 years if we continued to spend so much on print publications. In the years past, our journal has had institutional support. And as budgets have been cut, as enrollments have slowed, sadly, my journal was one of the first things to go. And so without institutional support, the section had to handle the publication costs. So for me now, and for this journal, open access became a way for me to provide information to a greater number of people, to create visibility, and to defray some of the costs associated with publication. And I don't think the quality for our journal has taken a hit at all.
Yeah.
If anything, it's freed me up to provide more editorial experience and less worry about the logistics of publication.
I was going to say that sounds, and plus now your students have access to it as well. You've now opened it
That's
up
right.
for everybody to read.
So as we were looking at subscription numbers, if our journal is only available to the 100 subscribers or libraries, well, clearly our readership isn't going to expand. And one of the things that we have noticed in the past decade is that those researchers in the American Folklore Society who work in children's folklore have become increasingly older, right? We're not getting those younger graduate students, and there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with new laws associated with research. But our feeling was that by going open access, not only we would be able to get our journal, our articles out to more people immediately. We'd be able to use the internet more freely, social media as ways of plugging in and giving people immediate access to the content. So as I looked at open access, for me, it was a no-brainer. We had really no other choice. Go open access or end. And I'm glad we made the jump.
I'm glad too. I think it's great. I think to really be able to read that and access that, even as a researcher myself, but like for students, I think of my own students who are teaching at a small college, it's like they hit that wall and they couldn't go any further.
Yeah, what are you supposed to do?
So I kind of, what about your field as a whole? What about folklore as a whole? Do you think it's starting to become more of a trend, or how do you notice the field engaging with open access?
When I started looking into this back in 2016, I reached out to other editors of folklore journals, and I asked, how are you guys dealing with this? Some of those journals have institutional support, so the immediacy of the financial concern maybe hasn't hit them yet. But I remember last year at the AFS, the American Folklore Society conference in Minneapolis, because so many journals were investigating going open access, that the American Folklore Society invited Indiana University and the Open Access Forum to come out, provide us some information. I know that many journals are considering it. We have great journals like New Directions in Folklore, which is also hosted out of Indiana University, which has kind of been the flagship, at least the model that I have followed with the Children's Folklore Review. They've been able to be very successful in being a voice, not just through that platform, but through social media and engaging with the audience in issues related to folklore. I think at this moment in our cultural and political history, folklorists have a lot to say and should be invited into conversations more regularly. That they are not, or that smaller independent non-folklorists have had a lot of success of carrying the folklore mantle to the masses. It says a lot about the current state of the American Folklore Society and failures of folklorists to present that information in ways or in platforms that is accessible by the masses. And now is a great time for folklorists to speak out about the meaning of folklore and this increase in supernatural studies. Slender Man seems to be a hot button topic, and I know many folklorists have had success discussing Slender Man in books and articles or in movies, etc. So I think this is an excellent opportunity for folklorists to go open access in order to, again, to create that visibility and to engage in conversations that are driving the larger American and global societies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. I really hope to see a lot more engagement with folklorists in general.
Good. Yeah.
That's kind of all the questions I have. But I was wondering, do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share with us or with open access in general?
You know, I mean, I'll just allow this to be a testimonial. The transition from print to open access online was seamless. And of course, I have a lot of thanks to give to the people who work behind the scenes who helped with that transition. The platform is easy to use. It's an easy way to track viewers and to see what articles and what content is gaining traction. It's a great way for me to explore how successful I can be using alternative outlets to kind of publicize. So if I go into Twitter and I say, check this out, I can go back and immediately see what type of impact that had. And so as an editor, I'm able to see in real time just how successful different avenues of advertising are. And I've seen it increase. Of course, there was only an uptick possible in the amount of readers and engagement that our journal could have. So for any editors out there considering open access, I would highly recommend it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I think this has been great. There's lots of clips, and I think just like talking about open access, like you just made me feel more passionate about it too. Like just more passionate about it.
Oh, that's great, Brian. I'm happy that could go well. And thanks for the invitation, you guys.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it so much. You have a good day.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that. Our second interview was with Willa Tavernet, who is the Open Scholarship Resident and the Visiting Assistant Librarian at Indiana University Bloomington. And she works in the Scholarly Communications Department, along with me. She was formerly an attorney, and she worked in lots of legal contexts before getting her MLIS at the University of Iowa in 2017. She's particularly interested in scholarly communications and research data management, politics and policy, and social justice. We talked to her about diverse voices in open access, what open access means and how she got interested in it, and what will happen next with it. I hope you enjoy it. I would just like to get started today by thanking you for being here. My name is Brian. I'm just going to interview you today about open access and kind of the policy and like your background around it. But I would like to start by asking you to tell us about like the context you work in here. What's your name, your title, and what department do you work in Indiana?
My name is Willa Tavernier. I work in the Scholarly Communications Department, and I'm the Open Scholarship Resident Librarian. What my job entails looking at the scholarly output and inputs in the platforms that the department maintains, which is mostly the institutional repository and the open journals publishing systems. Building on that, I then expect that where I find gaps, whether it's gaps in terms of departments, publishing, or the types of people who are publishing, that I will then reach out to a variety of groups to get more inclusive voices into the repository and hopefully into the journal system, because both of these platforms form part of the cultural record of Indiana University. So we want that record to be as complete as possible. We don't want to exclude any groups from their voices being heard.
So how did you get interested in scholarly communications or like diversity in particular?
Well, I recently finished my MLIS at University of Iowa, and I didn't come into doing that degree in librarianship with a clear idea of what sort of librarianship I wanted to go into. I was a practicing lawyer, and I was interested in knowledge management, and that's the reason that I pursued that degree. While there, young woman who became my mentor, or I should say a colleague now, who became my mentor, she came to speak to our class as part of a pro seminar that was organized to expose us to different facets of librarianship. And she came to speak about publishing and in particular open access. And it struck a chord with me because the way the scholarly publishing system has evolved, it really does exclude a lot of people from having access to it because of the paywall, the traditional nature of journal publishing, where you have to pay a subscription or a per article fee to be able to access the information that's there. And in the age that we live in now, access, it's part of our lifestyle. We expect to have access to information. And that is the norm in most spheres. It's not the norm in scholarly publishing. It really is an exclusionary construct.
If I may ask, how did moving from being a lawyer into moving into being a librarian, how did that shape your view?
Well, in practicing law, which I did for almost 2 decades, you know, there's a lot of ways that you can help people, but a lot of the times you also turn out to just be serving the interests of a particular group of people as well. When I made the decision to actively pursue librarianship was really at the very end of my degree, right up until maybe a month or 2 before I finished my program. I still had all my plans in place to return to my former position and to use my knowledge management skills. And I had seen opportunities here and there. When I saw the opportunity at Indiana University, Bloomington for this particular position, it really spoke to me. And I tell people this when I look at applications that I submitted for other positions and the letter I wrote for this one, it's like chalk and cheese. You can see someone commented to me, you really put your heart into this. Because it did strike a chord with me, especially the opportunity to work across boundaries, across disciplines, across the campus, to reach out to groups who might be underrepresented in receiving library services or benefiting from library services and benefiting from information and access to that information, and even benefiting by having their work become visible within the publishing system. So I was really excited about that, and also about the opportunities for gaining more technical expertise, because we use a lot of technology. We use a lot of different technologies in libraries, and this allows me to build on some skills that I have and also learn a lot of new technologies that I'm interested in. So it was sort of that perfect fit of people and technology and passion and doing something important. So it was really getting this particular position that motivated me to transition from law to librarianship.
You kind of talked about it earlier, how the attraction to making unheard voices heard or unseen perspectives seen. Can you talk a little bit more about why open access as a philosophy and as a principle is important?
So this is why I think open access is important. We have this construct that we call the academy when we think of universities, and it was built on a particular set of values that emerged in, say, the 40s, 50s, where really universities were dominated, and perhaps still are, by middle class, white, male, cisgender, quote unquote, normally abled persons. That was the typical profile. That was what the workforce looked like. That was what the academy looked like. So that was what scholarly inputs and outputs looked like as well. So even though great strides have been made to have more diverse and inclusive environments, we have a long way to go. What I believe open access does is afford an alternative and sometimes a quicker path for underrepresented groups to be able to display their scholarship. Disciplines tend to be very rigid. There's a certain way of doing things. There are certain venues that you publish in. There are certain steps that you have to take if you want to get the right job, if you want to gain tenure. And change is very hard to bring about. And it's possible that the existing system might never change. But what open access does is it provides another path. And it's a path that significant players in the existing scholarly system have appreciated is a viable path, because some of the biggest open access publishers are also the biggest traditional publishers. But what open access does is provide a platform where, let's take our open journal system, for example. A group or a university department or a student body can come to the scholarly communications department with an idea for a journal and be able to publish it at a very low cost and get their scholarly inputs into that journal and be made visible on the internet for online access, for everyone to have access to that. Institutional repository. There are a lot of scholars out there who might have come from non-traditional paths who have non-traditional outputs. There's a lot beyond just the journal article. So they may have a plethora of conference papers. They may have done, they may have built digital work. They may have done digital humanities work. And the repository is a platform where they can showcase something like that. There are a lot of tools out there, one of which the department is really investing in right now is ORCID, where a researcher can create a unique identifier that links all of their work together and disambiguates it from other work. And when you combine that with the power of institutional repositories hosted by institutions like Indiana University that are committed to long-term preservation of what you put in their repository, it really makes a researcher much more visible, because you can say, okay, this is that person's work, this is where it is, and you know it's going to be there. People can capture ephemeral content about themselves and curate it using some of these tools to build a fuller profile of who they are as a researcher and as a scholar.
So in a sense, open access journals, particularly open access repositories, lower the bar for participation of anybody who's not necessarily coming from that standard background, or even those who are. It allows their work to be shared much more widely and much more easily. Yes,
it does allow their work to be shared much more widely, much more easily, and it lets them be visible. I don't think necessarily in terms of lowering the bar. I would think of opening the door wider,
lowering the cost.
Definitely lowering the costs, the costs of access, not the quality of scholarship. And the good thing about open access is it's right there. You can assess scholarship at a granular level and not necessarily by the journal it's published in. So it may even increase the quality of scholarship and change the way we start to look at scholarship.
Have you noticed some changes since you've been working with these problems? Is there something in the field that are giving you hope as far as increasing prevalence of open access?
Well, what I would say is that there's a lot of ground to be covered still. I think that the open access systems have matured to a point now where we have a history that we can look back at and analyze, and we can theorize open access, because one of the key driving factors behind the open access movement really was cost. The costs of journal access mostly for libraries and similar institutions. Quite frankly, open access hasn't lowered those costs, but it has had a lot of other benefits. And you can see the excitement among students who learn about this for the first time. Faculty like here at Indiana University Bloomington who are willing to make a commitment to an open access policy so that their scholarship can be visible to anyone who needs to have access to it. It actually encourages better scholarship simply because of the fact that you have more minds looking at it, building on it, reworking it, testing data sets for reliability and reproducibility. It lends itself to better scholarship. So there's hope there. But there's also the concern that you could have a replication of the traditional scholarly publishing system with all the big traditional publishers moving into the open access field and possibly offering better tools for researchers in terms of tracking their impact. We see, big publishers buying up formerly independent software and turning that to their advantage, which it's almost inevitable. But we hope that there's enough room in the landscape to continue building on the work that's being done so that we keep moving towards a truly open environment, and we can think of open educational resources, we can think of open online courses, open data sets being deposited for persons to use and rework, as well as, just traditional open access publishing. And it's not that there's no cost. It's shifting the cost burden almost. Commitment of funders to open access publishing is going to be key so that the cost of open access publishing doesn't fall disproportionately on groups who can least afford it, because this has been driven by an author pays model where once the author pays and it's published, everyone has access, which is different from the traditional model where the author doesn't pay, but no one has access unless they pay. So there's still a cost. There's always going to be a cost. There's labor involved. There's intellectual labor in the production of the research, as well as in putting it in a form to be disseminated. We just have to figure out the best model to make it sustainable.
As you talked a little bit about the past and like how we can now analyze the past of open access and look towards the future. I think you've talked a bit about how we can go to the future. So to kind of draw us towards that general conclusion, what do you think is next for open access?
I think funders are going to be a key, but I think theorizing an underlying rationale and a model for open access that is multidisciplinary, that is global in scope, that involves a variety of stakeholders, and maybe will not turn out to be a one-size-fits-all approach. There may be different models for society publishers, than university presses, than traditional publishers. What we want to make sure of is to ensure access for as many people as possible, both the researchers who are publishing as well as those who need access to the research that is being published. So that's what we have to move towards, developing scalable models that give everyone who wants to participate the opportunity to participate.
And I think that's perfectly sums up kind of the last thing I want to ask about, which is how do we or how should we think about diverse voices, diverse perspectives? How should we think about bringing those into that open access model in the future?
Well, I think one of the key things is to recognize that everybody brings something unique and that people are multidimensional, and we can't have a predefined notion of what constitutes diversity. What certainly is a good start is targeted outreach to groups that we know that are underrepresented. And that might look different in every institution. It might look different in every country. It might be women. It might be rural communities somewhere else. It might be queer communities. It might be ethnic minority communities. It will look different for each institution. I think data is going to be key so that you know what your community looks like and what's reflected in your records. And then you can go out and see what are the community's strengths and concerns and how they want to participate and how you can facilitate that participation. There's no straightforward answer to that question, unfortunately.
Right. This is a matter of building on it, building on each community's strengths and using the data and moving forward in the future.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of all the questions I had for you, but I guess, do you have any final thoughts you want to add about open access or diversity in general?
Yeah, we're still very much mired in that traditional construct when it comes to publishing, and we have to start thinking beyond that. We have to start investigating what is it in our institutions that is causing barriers to people who are different from the norm. So we have to be introspective as we move forward as well, and be willing to do the work that it takes to change the landscape and to make institutions spaces where all different types of people can enter and thrive.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This is great. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, where would they do that?
Well, they can go to the library's website, the Scholarly Communications Department. All the department staff, their profiles are listed there, along with email address and phone number. IU Bloomington Libraries.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.